All right, good morning, good morning, good morning. This is Helen Thomas and the CDFM study group. You are here for the live session or you will be reviewing the video after the fact. The purpose of this session today is for us to complete review of CDFM Module 2, Competency 1, Defense Budget Process. This is part 2. Part 1 was done last week because there was a lot of key individuals, key documents involved in that process. And then we will complete part 2 today. You need to understand the processes, the key individuals involved, the documents, where things happen, when they happen, who produces what document, and so forth, in order to be successful on the exam. So even though I take it in chunks, when you're done, you should be able to put this all together. And that is my goal once we go through the processes. I'm going to recap a few things to get us back to where we are today. I'm not going to go through everything we did last session right now, but I need to recap since a few of you or some of you were not here last week and or you didn't have a chance to go over the material. So when we started off module 2, we started off with understanding the mission of the Department of Defense to provide that security to our country. This is a certified defense financial manager exam. So the focus is what is going on at the Department of Defense and higher. We learned that there were 11 combatant commands and the importance of them, because we learned that the operational chain of command and how the country runs from the president to the Secretary of Defense to those combatant commanders. However, we also learned that since the president is a civilian, your Secretary of Defense is a civilian, you have combatant commanders are your military forces that are responsible for different parts of the globe. And so in order to translate what the civilian side wants to the military side, here comes the next key player. What is that key player that helps those civilians translate the orders to those combatant commanders? I like to do check on learning, so you're staying with me as we go. So who advises the president and the SecDef on those orders? So that is the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. Every service have a representative or joint staff at the highest level who advise your civilian part. You got the chairman is in charge of all the joint staff. And then as we went along, we learned that the 1986 Goldwater-Nichols Act created the position of the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. And you might say, well, what happened before 1986? That means every service had their own representative and they were kind of like fighting for their own or speaking on their own behalf, versus now you have the one chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff who speaks for all the services. He synchronizes the joint efforts together. So for those just coming on, I am recapping some of the things we talked about last week to get us to where we are today. The chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff has a vice chairman that assists in synchronizing all these efforts. The last session, we talked about the big op order. What is the big op order called? Y'all gonna make me call names? All right. So the highest board or the highest organization that we deal with is the National Security Council. That is made up of the president, the vice president, the Secretary of Defense, Treasury, and a few other standing members. What they do is they analyze the status of the country to determine what strategies, objectives, focus, all of that. Where do we need to focus our resources? So the National Security Council When they're done with their analysis, they produce the national security strategy. That is the big op order. And that's what I call it, but it's easier to remember. Because what do you do with an op order when you get it? You look at it and you determine what are you responsible for in this op order to meet your requirements. So the Secretary of Defense also looks in the national security strategy to determine what defense related things they have to do. And so once the SecDef is done with that, he produces the national defense strategy. This is how the defense is going to operate in order to meet the national security strategy. And included in that national defense strategy, it is the national military strategy. Who develops the national military strategy? Does anyone want to take a stab at that one? That is your chairman. Think about who's your top military person, your chairman. So your chairman completes or develops the national military strategy. However, we do not, as a military, we don't get guidance or policy from the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. We get it from the Secretary of Defense. Last session, we also went over the functions of the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. And in order to understand the function, you have to remember that Department of Defense have 3 support systems that they use. They use JCITS, Joint Capabilities Integration and Development System, PPBE, Plan, Program, Budget, Execute, and the Defense Acquisition System. Those 3 systems overlap. And those are the systems that the Department of Defense uses to execute its mission. Now let's talk about each one of those systems. So after the Department of Defense determined the defense program guidance, the planning guidance, what is its strategy? Defense planning guidance. It says these are the list of things that the Department of Defense needs to do to meet the national security strategy. So the Joint Staff gets together in the Joint Requirements Oversight Council, the JROC. The Vice Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff is in charge, is the chairman of that JROC Council. What they do, they now sit down. This is the strategy. These are our capabilities. But oh, by the way, we're missing a capability in this area. They're looking at doctrine, organization, training, leader development, facilities, .mlpf. If you Google that acronym, you'll see. They look in each one of those areas. They're analyzing to figure out where does the capability gap lie. If the result of to fix that capability gap is anything other than material solution, it triggers the PPBE system. If it's a material solution, an equipment that they need, that triggers the 3rd system, the Defense Acquisition System. So we say that the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff is the chairman of the JROC. Remember, 3 DoD systems, JCITS, PPBE, and the Defense Acquisition System. So Vice Chairman is the chairman of the JROC, and the Vice Chairman is also a co-chairman on the acquisition side. Their job is to make sure they're linking all of the P process. When we need the resources, what do we need? What are we developing? All of those systems is chiming together. And so you will see that the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff sits on the JCIT side and also on the Defense Acquisition System. So we say the mission of the Department of Defense is to provide security to our nation, our allies, and so forth. They have those 11 combatant commanders. That is important because the resources are funneled based on those requirements. What does the national security strategy say the focus is, and which combatant command is in that area. Any questions so far? All I'm doing is recapping what we did the last session, some of it rather. So as we went along, if it triggers the PPBE process, that's plan, program, budget, execution, I'm telling the story. Now you need to know who's in charge of each one of those phases at the Department of Defense. The planning phase, who's responsible for the planning phase? At the DoD level. Y'all not gonna talk to me today? Oops. Here, let me put my power cord in before my battery goes low. Stand by. Who's in charge of it? Let there be lights. All right. So the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, USD. Oh, I see one. Yay. Who's that? Ms. Grimes. Good answer in the chat. So the USD for Policy is in charge of the planning phase of P. Planning is where they now take, all right, this is the capability gap, what it's going to take, and it's not material. So we just need more resources. We need more equipment. We need more manpower. So all of that triggers goes into the PPBE process. Planning phase is now, let's put it into a plan so we can brief all the subordinate agencies. And so the final document at the planning stage is called what? After we go through planning. So I'm going to go all over the place because the exam is not going to go in order. So I'm going to be all over the place. So you're not going to be able to follow me in the book. Just kind of recall some information. All right. So the final document at the planning stage is the Defense Planning Guidance, National Defense Planning Guidance. But before you get there, remember, let's not forget those combatant commanders. The initiation of that planning phase begins with knowing what those combatant commanders need, right? Because they're the ones that's going to be responsible for those areas to meet the strategy. So what is the name of the document that those combatant commanders submit to let everyone know their requirements in their particular area? IPL. Thank you. All right. Ms. Grimes is on a roll. So the integrated priority list is the only one associated with IPL is combatant commanders. So the planning phase starts when the combatant commander says, I'm responsible for NORTHCOM. You say the priority is here. These are our shortfalls. We need more personnel. We need more equipment. We need more resources. And then the defense planning guidance is the final document. Now we move on to the programming phase. Who is in charge of the programming phase of the PPBE? That is the DCAPE. That's the Cost Assessment Program Evaluation Guide. That's all over the place. The DCAPE comes up quite often. Anything to do with cost analysis, that's the Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation. So now we're at the program, that's where you're talking POM and all of that, Program Objective Memoranda. To be successful on the CDFM, you got to be able to tell a story. So after you study, then you need to be trying to do what I'm doing. All right, so the DCAPE provides guidance before we start the programming phase. The DCAPE is also responsible for updating this database that keeps track of all the DoD's resources, appropriations needed, services that use it. What is the DoD database that keeps track of the major force programs? These are all the category of things the Department of Defense is allowed to do. These are all the mission and the resources. What is that? FYDP, that's correct. Future Year Defense Program. So now we move on. Nope, let's say What is the final document at the end of the programming phase? Come on, Miss Chanel, you're on the road. You can't stop now. What is the final document at the end of the programming phase? We say the DCAPE is responsible for giving us the guidance through the process, but they're updating this FYDP, Future Year Defense Program. At the end of each phase, there's a document, a guidance, a policy that is published. At the end of the programming phase is called the Defense, Program Decision Memorandum, PDM. DK, FYDP, PDM, yes, Program Decision Memorandum. That's on page 2141 for those who want to flip through. And then you move on to the budgeting phase. Who is in charge of the budget? This would be an easy one at the DOD level. Now we're talking the budgeting phase of P. That's budget and execution, really. That is the USD comptroller, correct? So remember, whenever you're at the DOD level, the titles of the secretariats is typically Under Secretary of Defense Policy, Under Secretary of Defense Comptroller. So if they say ASA, FMMC, you're like, no, because that's at the Army level. It's USD Comptroller. Don't get confused. And DCAPE, Director of Cost, that's one of the outliers, is by himself, but that's at the DOD level. So then you move to the budget, where now we got to translate those programs. We have a plan. We had to translate them into individual programs because we only got 11 programs. So we got to figure out where they lie. And then in the budget phase, because we got to go to Congress to ask for the money, we got to translate the programs into budget language, into appropriation language. And so the USD comptroller is in charge of the budgeting phase. On the budgeting phase, as they're going through that process, the USD comptroller and at the OMB level, who's OMB? What is the purpose of OMB? Office of Management and Budget. That's a new player we just talked about. We didn't talk about them last week. You can either speak it or put it in the chat. What is the purpose, or what does OMB stands for? Office of Management and Budget. What do they do? And why does the USD comptroller sit down with OMB? Because to understand if you know their relationship, then you'll know what they're doing. You already told me that the USD comptroller is in charge of the budget, which means they have to send the budget to somebody higher. The higher to USD comptroller is the OMB. OMB is the chief financial officer in charge of the executive branch, the president. They go together. And so when the budget estimate is put into place, they do a face-to-face meeting, thank you, during the fall review. That's a term that's in the book that you need to understand what's going on. We don't just submit a budget and we get what we want. We have to sit down with our hire to justify why we're asking for the money that we're asking for. What is the final document at the end of the budget phase? Da-da-da. It's called the Program Budget Decision. So it was end of the budget, program budget decision. However, there's also a system that is being updated during the budget phase. They got to update the numbers as things either increase or decrease. There's a system that's it's an automated system that's being used. Does anyone know what that system is? That is the Comptroller Information System, the CIS. So just like you update the Future Year Defense Program with the program information as you go through the process, on the budget side, you're updating the CIS automated system. Because remember, these things are always happening. P process is continuous. So you can have the FYDP being updated on one side with some data and also the CIS. So now that brings us to today's part 2. I had to do that, as you can see, because that was a lot of information that if you didn't get or understand anything I was talking about before, you have to go back, get that before you can pick up where we are today. And so today we're going to pick up on page 2.1.49, the president's budget, the Pres Bud. So that's the purpose of going through that budget estimate submission process so they can get to the president budget. That's the purpose of USD comptroller sitting down with OMB personnel so we can get included in the Pres Bud. On page 2149, the very start of that paragraph tells you the law that required the president to submit the budget to Congress no later than the first Monday in February. That is the 1974 Congressional Budget Act. You may or may not be asked the laws, so just in case, that's where you need to look. Now, on the bottom of page 49, the execution. So after the president budget is submitted to Congress, then it has to go through several stages, different parts of Congress. So let's go to the bottom of page 50 and 51. So let's 50. So this is also covered in module 1. So that's why I always advise you guys to go back, and I see the question is to go back to the different modules. Even though you might be focused on module 2, a topic like this is also covered in module 1. You want to go back to module 1 because sometimes the information is easier to understand in another module. All right, so your question says, what does the BEST do? So budget estimate submission, the BEST is so just like you have the POM on one side, you have the BEST on the other. That is the process we go through to ask Congress for the money every year. That's the simplest way to explain it. So if the programming phase can take 6 years of processing what we need, but we get budget every year. So they have to go through the BEST process every year. So on the bottom of 50, it's telling you once the president turns over the budget to Congress, it goes through several phases. Phase 1 at the bottom, concurrent budget resolution. When you go back to module 1, you see concurrent tells you that the action is happening both in the House and the Senate. What you need to know is which House and which Senate is responsible for the concurrent budget resolution. That is the House Budget Committee and the Senate Budget Committee. What are they doing? You also need to know is they're working internally to determine the guidelines they're going to use when they review the president's budget. So the concurrent budget resolution does not go to the president again to be signed as a law, because it's not a law. This is just a process. That's phase 1. On the top of page 2151, the second phase is the authorization process, Congressional Authorization Defense Programs. So the POM is reviewed in the authorization process. The House and Senate Armed Services Committee are the 2 offices in Congress that's responsible for the authorization of programs. So think about the POM and the BEST. The BEST is the budget, so the BEST is covered under appropriation. But what you need to know between the authorization and the appropriation is both of those have to go to the president for the president to sign for them to become law. Authorization of programs. The only thing that authorization process does, it authorizes the programs, the category of things that we are allowed to do. Even if they list funding under the authorization, it does not give us budget authority to spend money. And I'm going to give you an example that you may see in the future. The appropriation is handled by the House and Senate Appropriations Committee. Again, you need to know who runs it and does it go to the president. And yes, of the 12 subcommittees are the 12 appropriations. This goes to the president for it to become a law, for us to get a budget, which y'all should be quite familiar with how that process runs. And so the HAC and the SEC are responsible. The reason I also say go back to module 1, because what module 1 will show you a diagram that lets you know when the budget goes to the House and the Senate, both sides look at it. They say, yeah, nope, I got a problem with this one. Only one document can go to the president for the president to sign. So eventually the House and the Senate has to come together to do what? What do they do when the House and the Senate comes together? What is the purpose? Okay, the purpose of the House and the Senate coming together is to resolve differences. Whenever you hear they're having a conference, Congress is having a conference, that means is both sides are coming together only to resolve their differences. If they agree on everything else, they don't need to talk about it. So they vote as one entity. If the House sends one member and the Senate sends 10 people, they don't have any advantage because they're voting as one House and one Senate, but they both have to come to some type of resolution so that that one document can go to the president to be signed for it to be an official budget. Any question on that congressional enactment process? So what I stated earlier between the authorization and the appropriation, if you see it again, and they say in the authorization law, we receive 5 million for a program. In the appropriation, we receive 2 million. How much do you have for the program? You only have what you are appropriated, not what's authorized. So don't get confused, because that word they might say, in the appropriation law, you are authorized 2 million. So they'll use those words. So just remember which stage am I in and what am I allowed to do. All right, page 53, no questions or hands. If you have a question, please put your hand up as stated. Let me pause. Let's go ahead and address it before we move along in the process. All right, so now we're on the execution side. And it's not stated here, but I like to cover it because this is also in module 1, is 2 things happen once Congress appropriates the funds. Once the president signs it and it's official, 2 things happen. The first thing, which is a legal step, is the Treasury issues the Treasury warrant. Because what happens if we don't have an appropriation and we don't have a CR? What happens? Miss Wildy, what happens? The government was shut down. That's correct. So every time you hear the government might shut down, that tells you either we will not have a CR, temporary appropriations, or we do not have an actual appropriation. So the legal part under Article 1, Section 9, it says, again, Module 1, it says that we must have an appropriation law in place for the Treasury for us to take money out of the Treasury. So once Congress appropriates the money, gives it to the president signs it, it becomes law. The Treasury now can issue a Treasury warrant. And all that is a notice that they have received a notice that the law is in effect and the account has been set up for FY24, for instance. The second thing that happened is the apportionment process, the admin side of things. So the Treasury is the actual money, and then the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, which is the top level budget folks, is they begin the apportionment process where they give money down to Department of Defense, Department of Energy, and so forth, education. So on page 53, they go into different appropriation categories. You got MILPERS and O&M, which are expense type. Okay, it's on the other page. So let's just go ahead to the other page, page 54. That chart kind of lays it out for you. That you have MILPERS and O&M. If you see to the far right, tells you their description and their obligation. You're going to need to know the obligation period. Our 1 year expense type appropriations. RDT&E is a 2 year. Procurement is a 3 year, but you also have Shipbuilding Conversion Navy, SCN, which is a procurement, but it's a 5 year appropriation, and military construction is a 5 year appropriation. What does that mean, Ms. Helen? That means that those appropriations are good for new contracts within those timelines. What you need to also know from page 54 is some of the alternate uses of the O&M, operation and maintenance. If you have minor construction up to $2 million, you can use O&M for it. Likewise, if you have procurement items that you need to buy and it's not more than $250,000, you can also use O&M funding to procure items. So those are the two major things that I point out of when you don't have to go to Congress to get procurement and MILCON if those individual requirements meet those thresholds. So we say that MILPERS and O&M are 1 year. So on page 55, they have the annual funding policy. We got to go to Congress every year to get new fund budget authority. On page 56, it talks about incremental funding, as you needed funding. That's RDT&E. It's in that slide or on that paragraph under it. Versus 57 is full funding. That is procurement and military construction. Those two types of funding are full funding, meaning I can't use half the money to build a ship. I need to know I'm going to get the full amount of the money. Page 58 goes over a term, advanced procurement. What you're thinking about or should think about is, when do you obligate? When do you need the money? The long lead time might say, if I need a ship by October, I probably have to start building it from October last year. So that means I need the money in FY23, or I need the money in FY22 to make sure that I can get that ship by the end of FY24. I don't know how long it takes to build a ship, but long lead time. So they talk more about multi-year on page 59, but I'm going to take it over to page 61, 2.1.61. Because if you see it again, based on this knowledge, I'm going to tell you how you may see it in the future. You need to know the appropriation life cycle. What am I talking about? We just went over all the current or phase 1 of the appropriation life cycle. If I'm talking MILPERS, O&M, I said it was 1 year. RDT&E, 2 years. Procurement, 3, except for shipbuilding, conversion, Navy, which is a 5, and military construction is a 5 year. That knowledge will tell you if you're in phase 1, phase 2, or phase 3. What you also need to know is, what are you allowed to do with those appropriations in those phases? Phase 1, we say we can enter into new contracts. That's the main thing. It's available for new obligations. After every appropriation is in the current state, the next phase, phase 2, is expired. Every appropriation stays in the expired state for 5 years. Knowledge 1. Knowledge 2 is, what can you do with those appropriations when they're in that expired state? You can make upward and downward adjustments only. No new contracts. And you might say, okay, people get it. I get these questions all the time. Whoa, we got like 2 million left from FY23, and I got a shortfall this year. Can I use that money to do this new contract? No, you still can't do it. So it's obvious that everybody don't get it. So expired simply means I already started, had the approval, started a contract, a MIPR, a WBS, whatever, in the prior year, and now I'm making an adjustment, whether upward or downward, on that expired account. And then once that expiration ends, after that 5th year, on that 6th year, that account enters the closed or canceled, which is phase 3. What can you do with those funds in phase 3? Nothing. Because what happens is the funds are then released back to the Treasury's accountability in the miscellaneous receipts account. And let me see if it says it. Cancel. Yeah, so I'm 62, they're explaining what I'm talking about. I like diagrams because it forces me to learn what's going on in the process instead of just sitting there and reading it. However, you also have, you'll see on, I'm still on page 61, you'll still have an option in phase 3. If you get a bill, so we closed out FY18 last year. So let's say today I get a bill from an invoice from FY18 and it's only for $10. If I have the $10 in the same appropriation, I can spend up to 1% of current appropriation to pay for a bill on a canceled account. Does everyone understand that? Or does anyone have any question? So that 1% rule, if you look under and read under cancel, you'll see it states it on page 62. So you have that exception to policy. Page 2163 goes into common obligating documents. That's your MIPRs, your contract, military, interdepartmental purchase request. Understand on the MIPR on page 63, you can either have a direct citation or it's reimbursable. Direct means I give you my account number and you're charging from my account. Or reimbursable, you spend your money and then I pay you back for work. So those are 2 options on the MIPR. And how is that translated? So you will know if it's a project order on page 64 versus an Economy Act order. You need to know the differences. All the feedback I always get about these 2 topics is you're comparing which one am I dealing with. So the major differences between a project order. First thing you need to know, project orders are done with another DoD agency. An Economy Act MIPR or Economy Act order is done with other government agencies. That's one difference. The second major difference is on the project order side, you do not deobligate the funds at the end of the fiscal year. Versus Economy Act, you deobligate the funds. If you don't need it, you deobligate it once it expires, rather. What's the other one say? Order will produce a useful, yeah. So those are the two major differences between a project order and Economy Act order. Page 65 touches on contingent liability. So as a financial manager, what you're really concerned about is, when do I obligate the money? When do I need the money? A contingent liability says I have a contract, and in the contract, it says if the contractor completes the work, let's say in 10 days, they get additional money. So contingent liability means if the base contract is $10 and the bonus I will give them is $5, that means when I commit for that contract, I'm committing the full 15. But I'm only obligating the amount. There's different ways you can do it, but you just need to understand that contingency liability, it just means there's a condition that has to be met. Page 2166 talks about termination of contract. In most instances and all government contract, the second one is automatic. There's a clause in the contract that says the government can terminate this contract whenever they deemed it unnecessary. Contracted default means, as a contracting officer representative or office representative, you determine based on the checklist that contractor is supposed to do XYZ, they did ABZ. They're not fulfilling what they're supposed to do in the contract. And of course, you're working with the contracting officer, the KO, in this process. When you read through this, what you're going to understand is I have a requirement. I have a contractor doing the work. However, they're not fulfilling it, so I have to fire that contractor. If that COR accepted any of the work from that contractor, we got to pay them for what they accepted. However, I still have a requirement so that the rest of the funding, upward or downward adjustments, can be made to get a new contractor off of this contract to fulfill the obligation. So termination of contract due to contracted default versus termination for convenience of the government. All right, I'm pausing and breathing. Any questions? So a lot of this other stuff is straightforward. Yes. Page 2170. Even though I don't see the exam, I can guarantee you're going to see this. Why? Because it's in Module 1, Module 2, and Module 3. So it's a big enough topic where you may see it again. All right, what is the working capital fund? It's a revolving fund concept, typical customers, typical support. What are we talking about? My best example is, since everybody's familiar with the commissary. The commissary is a working capital fund. It's going to sound exactly like the civilian side, but there's a major difference. The commissary gets money. They take their money, buy the items to put on the shelf. Based on what it costs them to get the items to put on the shelf, they charge us a certain price for those items. We come in as the customer buys the food or the item, and then that money is put back and revolved back into that commissary process. That is exactly the same thing true as the civilian side. The major difference between the commercial side and the government side is the goal of the working capital fund is to break even. On the commercial side, their goal is to make a profit, but the government break even. So what that also means is they continuously have to look at their trend. If they consistently appear to earn a profit every year for the last 3 years, then you can guarantee that that fourth year, the prices in that commissary are going to drop. And typically they also issue the prices. I think they have to do it at the beginning of the fiscal year, if I'm not mistaken. Don't quote me on that one. But I think they have the price set so the customers know what they're charging. Like DFAST, they also are working capital fund. So yeah, they charge for what they do. That is how the money consistently rotates and how they get money to operate. On the top of page 71, it talks about the Defense Business Operations Fund. Building that revolving fund principal costs and performance are linked together, and the fund managers are expected to operate with cost goals established in operating and capital budget. This is just the DoD's term of us operating like a commercial business. Page 71 in the middle also explains how the working capital fund works. But you need to know there are two different types of working capital fund. You have stock funds, which they keep a stock of supplies. Industrial, where funds provided such as the depot maintenance, transportation, research and development. Those are the industrial funds. So those are the two types. On the bottom of 71, I also focus on things when they put it in bolds, because it must be important. For supply management, the major asset is inventory held for resale, while for non-supply management, the major asset is work in progress. So I either have the inventory to sell, or I have the job, the contract in hand, work in progress. So make sure you don't miss the last paragraph in page 71. Page 72 at the bottom, the goal of the Defense Working Capital Fund is to break even. They are a not-for-profit organization. So if you wanted to see in writing what I already stated, that's what it states. And they also explain it that they must sell services to customers for goods and services to recover. That's the revolving concept. And they have to stabilize their rates. They're not supposed to consistently make a profit or a loss over the long run. And 72 kind of answers my statement earlier that they have to publish their rates early, as it says. This requires them to submit proposed rates 12 to 24 months before the start of a fiscal year. Stabilizing the rates provides a significant advantage to customers in that we know the price of the product that we are buying from the Defense Working Capital Fund. So stabilized rate, key term. Page 73 at the top, net operating results divided by accumulated operating results. What are we talking about? Let me see. Because of the stabilized rate policy, the Defense Working Capital Fund will almost certainly have a gain or loss. However, they must over time achieve the break-even position. That's just repeating what I said. In each activity, profit or loss is the difference between total revenue and total expenses. How much money I took in versus how much I paid out. This profit or loss is called the net operating result. So that's point one. And the running total of net operating results over several fiscal years is the accumulated operating result. So whenever you see something in bold, that means you need to know what it is. So the difference between my profit or loss is net operating, and accumulated over time is accumulated operating result. And on page 74, they have some more information on the Defense Working Capital Fund. And I think in module 3, there's people usually say there's a lot of question on it, but I think they only have like 2 pages in that module on working capital fund. And as you can see in module 2, you got like, wow, 4 or 5 pages. So make sure you come back to this spot when you move on to the other modules. On page 75, receiving refunds. We receive refunds or rebates, the first bullet tells you where it goes back to the organization. What are we talking about? Let's say a soldier has a helmet. They're issued a helmet, they lose the helmet. They have to pay a cash collection voucher. They pay for the helmet out of their pocket. That money does not go back to that organization that they took it from. What it's telling you in that first bullet is the funds are credited to the miscellaneous receipts in the U.S. Treasury. The money goes back into the Treasury. So that's telling you for refunds and rebates, that's what happens to the money. Any questions? Are y'all like grasping everything I'm saying, or y'all just gonna go back later and review? All right. Can I get a thumbs up? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Just I'll make sure y'all still with me. All right. So page 40, 76 and 77 kind of goes into what I already talked about when we talked about the flow of funds. What happens once Congress appropriate the fund? The Treasury issuing the Treasury warrant, that's the legal step. And then the Office of Management and Budget, because that's the highest budget, folks, is they begin the apportionment process. So page 76, when they talk flow of funds, they're telling you from apportionment to outlay. Outlay is the same term, is similar to not similar, it is what we use disbursement. But the official term, when the funds are removed from the Treasury to liquidate an obligation, it is called an outlay. So make sure you know the term outlay. Some of you who haven't taken any of the other modules yet. Apportionment, whenever you hear apportionment, OMB apportion funds. We said earlier that Congress appropriated the funds because they have to approve it. The president just signs it to become law. Congress appropriated, OMB apportions. They're doing the same thing, but it's a different term. So based on the term, you will know where you are in the process. Module 1 also talks about appropriation, and Module 3, because it tells you in the apportionment, once Congress appropriates the funds, OMB does not automatically start apportioning funds. The agencies such as Department of Defense has to submit an SF 132, make sure I don't say the SF 182, the apportionment document to request their funding, apportionment. And so once the agencies within 10 days, they have to submit their apportionment request from OMB, then OMB has 30 days to issue the apportionment to each of the agencies. When the agencies get it, it's not on this page, but I'm using my knowledge from module 1 and 3, is the agencies such as Department of Defense will issue allotments, which is what we get from Department of Defense. And then we all commit, obligate, and outlay the funds. So when it says from apportionment to outlay, all of those steps I just went over is included in that process. So it also states upward, downward adjustments to expired accounts. Okay, we went over that. Upward adjustments, obligations, expired authority prior to obligation cancellation provides us the ability to make, all of this is repetitive. So that's why I say once you start going through the material several times, you'll see that a lot of it is repeating something is stated earlier. On page 77, accounting for canceled authority. It also going to let you know where does this canceled money go once FY19, which we're closing out now, once 1 October comes this year, what's going to happen to that money? the cancel authority. So the obligation status says the second paragraph at the very end, that it shall be deposited in the miscellaneous receipts account collections of receivables from canceled accounts in the treasury. So basically just say miscellaneous receipts, because there's different categories of it and we're not going to go into each of them, but it goes back to the treasury when the cancellation is complete. Page 78 is another thing that you need to know, because when we went over the flow of funds, Congress appropriates, OMB apportions, DOD issues allotment, commit, obligate, outlay. You have to remember that sequence, because once you learn these terms and they ask you, what is the unallotted apportionment? They're going to give you appropriated a dollar amount. And I think, let me see, this exercise has, yep. So while we're talking about this, if you want to flip to page 2181, you will see exactly what I'm trying to explain. Exercise. They're not going to tell you the formula, but they might say, what is the unapportioned appropriation? So they may not even put it in order for you. Right now, it's in order: appropriation, apportionment, allotment, obligation, outlay. But based on those terms on page 78, you have to know them and understand the flow of funds, because they can ask you practical exercise response, such as on page 81. And then finally on page 2179 and 80 is the non-appropriated funds. Now, Congress doesn't give us any money for these, but we do have installations that use morale and welfare NAF funds. There are 3 different types of NAF funds. Category A are those NAF funds that get 100% of all the money for them to operate are appropriated. So they do get some appropriated funds. So if you read through on the bottom of page 79, it'll tell you what are some examples of category A. That's your libraries, your fitness centers on your installations. These are of category A programs. That tells you they're all 100% funded. That's why you go in and you don't have to pay a fee, because they already getting money to operate. Versus a category B is 65% appropriated and 35% NAF, community support program. Let's see what some of the examples did they give. Youth service, child development centers, craft, the outdoor recreation. So these are some examples of category B, 65% appropriated, and the other 35% is NAF, based on a fee that they charge the customer. And the category C is 100% non-appropriated funds. That's your fishing, bowling, hunting. You got to pay a fee if you want to go fishing on the installation. They operate that revolving fund type operation, because all the money that they make to operate comes from what they charge the customer. So they just touch a little bit on the NAF. So again, as I stated, make sure you read over page 81, go over that exercise. And yeah, I would say normally we don't do the case studies, but you want to do the case studies for module 2, just to get your mind thinking. And again, as we end with module 2.1 today, the defense budget process, I'm going to again encourage you to review the information from the beginning and try to talk through the information, what's going on. Because as we go into 2.2 and we start talking cost and economic analysis, It's going to be just as brutal, and you don't want to forget what you learned in this first half. Any question on anything that I discussed today or even last week that you all have a question about? All right, I don't hear or see any questions. All right, well, that's all I have for today. Next week, we're going to come do, and I think, let's see, I don't know if I could do it in one, because that's another big session. Depending on where we get next week will determine if I break it up. That's another big area. The cost and economic analysis represents that third DoD system, that defense acquisition system, because it's going to go into cost analysis, economic analysis for those big ticket items. And so it's going to require you to be focused on that. And then once you get past module 2 and you get your CDFM, because you did 1 and 3, then you can take module 4, because module 4 is really all the 2.2 information and compounded. All right, so let me leave it at that for today. All right, this is Helen Thomas. If you have not already subscribed to our YouTube page, please go ahead and do so. Just click that button, because again, it doesn't cost you anything, but what it does is the more people click, the more people like, leave comments, touch that YouTube page, it then lets YouTube know, hey, we need to promote this more. We need to send this out to more people so people can find the YouTube page. I get a lot of feedback that is helping. And so that's why I continue to do what I do. So this is Helen Thomas and the CDFM study group. I'll see you guys again next time. Thank y'all for stopping by.